In this video, we'll be looking at how to study for GCSE and A Level exams by looking at the top 3 evidence-based study tips to help you improve your grade. So if you want to study smarter but not harder, then stick around to pick up some practical advice that you can apply right now. If you're new here, my name is Rachel. I'm a Cambridge University qualified coach, and I have worked with literally hundreds of GCSE and A Level students to help them gain the skill, the will and the mindset to achieve their potential in their exams and get into their top choice university. And I'll link in the description box a free downloadable one-page summary that will cover everything that we talk about in today's video. So let's get into it. Tip number 1, understand. Understanding is the foundation of learning. So the aim is to try and understand as you go. So why is it important? Understanding forces us to make connections with things that we already know, and that makes new information easier to remember. So for example, in GCSE biology, you learn that arteries carry blood away from the heart and that they are thick and elastic, and that veins carry blood back to the heart and that their walls are thin and flimsy. Now we could just try and remember that, but learning science has taught us that if we can understand that material, it will make it much more memorable. In this case, arteries have thick walls because it helps them to withstand the pumping pressure as blood moves away from the heart, and the elasticity helps to refer the pumping action down the artery. Veins carry blood back to the heart, so they're not subject to the same kind of pressure, and as a result their walls can be thin. The reason this works is covered in the book Make It Stick, which looked at all the evidence behind effective study techniques and talks about how cognitive scientists have shown that if we find new information arbitrary, so random information that doesn't really make sense, it's much harder for us to store. But the key thing here is it's often not that easy to learn new information. As we get into GCSE and increasingly as you move into A Level and you're learning a subject much more in depth, some of the concepts are quite hard to understand. So it's key to go into your study expecting understanding to be hard. All students struggle to understand certain concepts, but what the research shows that separates the top performers from the lower performers isn't that one group didn't struggle to understand, it's that the top performing students seek help to unlock that material and close the learning gap, whereas lower performing students have a much greater tendency to struggle on and think, oh, it's just me, or I'm not smart enough. So let's talk about 3 ways that we can apply this. The first might sound obvious, but it's to pay attention to what's being taught at school and then have the confidence to ask your teacher if you don't understand. The second is to use the subject study guide. These have often got good, simple explanations in them, and I'll link some of the top study guides in the description below. And lastly, find out the answer on YouTube or the internet. There are loads of high quality free tutorials on most subjects, so YouTube can be a great source of information. Tip number 2 is to test yourself. So once we've understood a topic, the next thing we should all be doing is testing ourselves on it. Sometimes this is called active recall or retrieval practice. So this technique involves asking yourself questions at the end of a study session, or just asking yourself questions as a study session itself. This is the most important study technique you will ever learn. Based on the work of Professor Dunlosky, who's done a meta-study looking at over 100 years of research in this exact area, there are studies that show 4 groups of students learning new material. One group studied the material normally, one group studied the material and did a concept map at the end of the study session, the third group reread the material 4 times, and the fourth group studied the material normally and then freely recalled everything they could remember with the book closed, and that group increased recall by on average 15 to 20%. Now I don't know about you, but if someone told me I could increase my grade by 15 to 20% just by asking myself questions at the end of a study session, that would be a technique that I would be all over. Despite all the evidence for this, many students aren't aware, and they're spending the majority of their time rewriting their notes, rereading material, highlighting and underlining things. So if you're doing these techniques the majority of your time, don't worry, it's fairly common. But unfortunately, the research is conclusive. All of these passive techniques are pretty much a waste of time. And this is what the authors talk about in the book Make It Stick. And they give the advice, which is also what I share with my students, that we should be testing ourselves more. I think one of the reasons we don't always do this is because when we think of study, we tend to think of it as getting information in. But over 100 years of research has shown that this process of getting information out of our brain is actually a key part of the learning process. So that all sounds great, but how do you apply it? Let's look at 4 key ways. Firstly, free recall. Study the information as you normally would, and then at the end of the study session, set a timer for 3 or 4 minutes and write down everything that you can recall from that 30 or 40-minute study session. Make sure you do this with the book closed. After the timer ends, open the book, fill in any gaps and correct anything that you got wrong. End of topic tests is another good one. Most study guides have these, but the key here is don't wait until you've learned the whole topic. Ask yourself questions on what you've learned at the end of every study session. Number 3, answering flashcard questions. Either you can use retro paper-based flashcards, which are great for learning facts, or you can use an app like Quizlet. The advantage of using an app is that you can access it anywhere. Quizlet is completely free, and I'll link it down below. And last but not least, tip number 4, exam questions. I can't emphasize enough how important these are. The key thing we want to do is nail an exam in the time allowed. And what's the best way to get good at that? It's by practicing exams. Examiners aren't very imaginative, so you'll tend to find the same type of questions coming up year after year. So the best way to gain confidence that you can do well in a real exam is to be doing well in past papers. A lot of students have a tendency to save past paper practice till right at the end, but actually these are the ultimate type of questions we want to be asking ourselves. So if we find questions on subjects that we know as we go along, it's a great way to practice your exam technique. And the last thing that's worth saying on this, testing yourself will feel hard. It's much harder to test yourself and do exam questions than it is to just passively rewrite your notes or get the highlighter out or start to underline things. But it's also much more effective. Your brain is like a muscle, it needs a workout, and studying needs to feel effortful in order to be effective. And tip number 3 is self-belief. This is a big part of what I work on with students in my program, because often when I see students who aren't achieving what they're capable of, it's because deep down they don't believe they're able to achieve more. Often it's because they don't believe that they're smart enough, but for whatever reason they don't believe that that better grade is available to them. Although this isn't often talked about, there's loads of research on this, or what the academics often call it, self-efficacy, which is the same thing. It's about your belief that you can achieve in a certain situation. 2 decades of research have clearly established the validity of self-efficacy as a predictor of students' motivation and learning. Self-efficacious students are able to achieve academically because they persist in the face of difficulties, because our beliefs about our ability go on to affect our motivation and our resilience. If 2 students come up against something that they don't understand, the student with high self-belief is much more likely to have the motivation and the resilience to power through because they believe they can do it. Whereas a student with low self-belief is much more likely to think, I knew I couldn't do it, and that their beliefs are being confirmed. So how can you get better at it? When I'm working with students, I always encourage them to start by setting their academic goals and to set themselves ambitious goals that they'll be proud to achieve. I then ask them to think about and write down, what do they need to believe about themselves, their abilities, and their intelligence if they're going to go on to achieve those ambitious goals. So I would encourage you to print out the free handout that comes along with this video and to ask yourself these questions, and then perhaps think about the differences between your current thoughts about yourself and how they need to change in order for you to achieve what you want to academically. As lots of academic studies have shown that what we believe about ourselves impacts what eventually comes true for us, I would encourage you to take advantage of that fact, back yourself, and set ambitious goals. After all, you can't possibly know what your potential is, because your potential will expand as you move towards it. And the thing I'd like to leave you with is, you might not have been taught how to study before, but remember, you can do it. So why not have a go at working smarter? Try and apply some of these techniques. I'd love to hear how you get on in the comments. Good luck, see you in the next one.